right? And so one of the things we can think about is as somebody becomes a more skilled reader, they have more opportunities to think about the spelling of a word and match it to its meaning. And so as you become more proficient, this pathway is probably used more often than this pathway. And so we can ask questions about whether or not that's actually true. Do skilled readers actually still make use of phonology when they read? And what does that mean for bilinguals? And asking this question in terms of this language on subsidy piece. So how do we go about figuring out if two languages are concurrently active? Well, we can be a little bit tricky about it and use words that that share information across languages. So the question that I want to pose is, what do bilinguals use shared technology between languages to activate meaning? Here's how I'm going to do it with homophones, right? So a homophone is a word, or a pair of words really, that share pronunciation, but they don't share meaning. And so in English, we can think of a pair of pairs if we wanted to, but if the two languages that I'm going to use are English and French. So we can think about English and French. We've got a shoe in English, and then shoe means cabbage in French. And so they share pronunciation, but clearly not meaning, not spelling. And so what we can ask is, when I present somebody with the word shoe, is there any evidence that they also activate shoe in French in terms of what they're doing? Right? And if they are, it really suggests that those two languages are co-activated and activated through phonology. So if we zoom in a little bit on the model that I showed you previously, I looked at orthography, phonology, and semantics, we can imagine, and then I'm telling you currently about a study that I did a couple of years ago using word recognition. We can have somebody see the word shoe, and if the task is in French, we can say un type de vêtement, type of clothing, and ask them if shoe is a type of clothing. Clearly not if we're using that orthography, right? But if they're using the phonology to activate the pronunciation, then maybe, right? Because for them, they see shoe, they activate the phonology, it activates the correct meaning, it also activates incorrect meaning, cause interference, and if it causes interference, then people should be slower at rejecting that shoe is a type of clothing, or if it was an English task, I gave you shoe and I said, is shoe a type of vegetable? Clearly, no, it's not, but people who are bilingual and know English and French have a harder time with that. So they're slower and they make more errors on something like that. So we can see with orthography, with word recognition, that bilinguals activate both these languages. One of the questions, though, is, well, how does this activation occur within the system, right? Because when we do reaction time data, it could be that, yes, okay, the shoe activated this, but then there was feedback here, everything reverberated, and yes, phonology was activated, but it was activated late. And so it happened while we were making the decision. It didn't happen during initial lexical access. So one way of investigating that is to use sentences and to use eye tracking. So you can take a look and see where people are looking at a particular time so that you know what's happening during immediate activation. So that's what we did in this study. We had participants read English sentences while their eye movements were tracked. Okay, so I don't know if people are familiar with eye trackers, but I will start by showing you what the eye tracker looks like. This is an Island 1000, and if you're a participant in the study, you have your chin on the chin rest, and you look and you read as the task is progressing, right? What's nice about this particular model is older models were actually such where you had to actually use dental mold, create a dental mold of somebody's bite, and they'd have to actually bite a bite bar to hold their face. This is much nicer. You sit on the chin rest, your eyes are tracked and calibrated. And so this is the type of sentences that we had people read. We had them read sentences that were in English, but then we inserted a critical word. And we inserted a language switch here. And so the language switch was either the homophone that we just identified as being important to know if people are able to activate information in the language. And then we compared it to a control word that doesn't have that shared representation. And then we also had a word that was the correct word for the sentence. What we're particularly interested in is how are people performing on this word compared to this word? Are they noticing the homophony, and is it helping them to understand the word? Because when they read it, they're thinking of the correct shoe. So here we're saying we would expect facilitation. Right? People should spend less time looking at this word than this word. And if they are, because they're matched on a variety of different word characteristics, then we would expect them to show homophony, or to show facilitation. And we can look at different measures of eye tracking. So the nice thing about eye tracking is there are a number of different independent measures we can look at. So one is first fixation. So first fixation is the idea that as I'm reading through, let's imagine that my cursor here is my eye movements. When I hit shoe, it's the very first time I hit the word, and then I fixate off. So it's the total amount of time from the first fixation on the word. So that's a measure of initial lexical processing because it's immediately as soon as you get the word. Then you've got gaze duration. So this is the amount of time you spend on the word before moving off to the rest of the sentence. So it might be I fixated here, and then I fixated here, and then I add those two fixations together, and that gives me the total amount of time for that measure. The idea here is that both of these are measures of early reading. So early lexical access, getting the sense of when that actually occurs. Total time is, as it sounds, the total amount of time you spend looking at a word. So I read the word, I move off, I come back, it's the total amount of time on the word regardless of where else I've looked on the screen. And that's more of a late measure because it gives a sense of how fast you can integrate information, right? And so the first two, initial lexical processing, the second one, or the third one rather, how much time to really understand what you're reading and integrate all of the words in the sentence. Okay, so we've set it up. Who are our people in this particular setting? We had 96 university students from Western and from Yale. And the nice thing about including these students is that there's a wide range of French knowledge in this particular sample. And one of the things we decided consciously to do is to not divide them into monolinguals and bilinguals, but to get measures of their actual knowledge. Because one of the things we know about monolingual French users is, or monolingual English users is, they'll clearly say they don't know any French, when in fact they were required to take 5 years of French in their program in Ontario. So what we did instead was we said, okay, you think you're in an English study, well, we're going to make you read a little bit of French to demonstrate that you don't actually know French. And to sort of hit on that, they actually do know some French. We are actually to say they do know French, they're just not quite sure what they're reading. So we had to do a couple background measures. So in our decoding task, it was the tower, which is the test of non-word reading efficiency. So basically, they have a card, they have 104 words on the card for the English words, and they have to read down the card as fast as they can in 45 seconds. And then we had to do that in French. We also had them do that with non-words, so silly made-up words, just to see how well they were able to do spelling sound correspondences in English and French. And so what you can see from the background measures here is that in terms of English relative to French, they're better in English as a group, the 96 students, as you would expect. What you would see actually with respect to the decoding in English versus decoding in French, they're actually pretty similar in terms of how they did there, and we think perhaps that's because in English, English is an inconsistent language, whereas French is much more consistent, so people seem to be okay at that. I've also provided you with the range so that you can see that certainly in terms of the French word decoding, even people who said, I really don't know any French at all, the person who scored the lowest scored a 26. So they're still able to read a number of these words in French. In terms of their word knowledge, however, we can see a fair difference here in that we had them do a task where they had to just tell us if the word was living or an object. So we gave them a word, they just pushed the button to say yes, it's living, or it's an object, and you can see that for the accuracy for English, it ranged from 68% to 99%, and for French, it was 41 to 94. So the person who got 41, didn't quite hit chance. So they were hitting buttons randomly in terms of knowing the words. But we get that range, right? We get that range that we're looking for. Okay, so this is our background information. What did we find in terms of that experimental task that I was telling you? Well, do we see processing difference on early measures? That's an important question because it tells us about that initial lexical access, what's happening there. But one of the things I didn't tell you when I was setting this up was we also manipulated word frequency. I thought I'd throw that twist in at this point so that we had a comfortable understanding of what the task was. Now we're going to add word frequency. So for those of you who do know French, right, if I give you shoe and plush, maybe you know one of them, maybe you don't. There are lower frequency words, Plush means bell, so it's not perhaps a little bit more frequent because if you went to French school, you'd know what plush. But for high frequency words, even if you feel like you don't know very much French at all, you might be familiar with wheat versus yeah. So ate versus yesterday. So these are higher frequency words, and people who have some French knowledge should be more comfortable with the high frequency words than the low frequency words. So we're interested in whether or not word frequency matters as well. All right, so now suspense here. What did we find? So if we take a look at our high frequency words, at our first fixation, we can see that there's a significant difference between looking at a word like wheat versus a word like yeah. They spend less time looking at the homophone, suggesting that they're sensitive to the homophony of it because they're matched on other characteristics. We don't see that for the low frequency words, but for the low frequency words, we do see another early measure, which is regressions out. So this is the idea that I'm reading a sentence, I get to something that I'm a little bit unsure of, and then I move back. Well, people are more likely to move back and look earlier in the sentence when it's a control word than when it's a homophone, suggesting they're integrating it a little bit better. So we're seeing some evidence here on early measures that they are sensitive to the homophony. Well, what about later processing as they're integrating? Well, this is where they clearly and quite definitively show that they found the homophones much easier to process than the control word. So 95 milliseconds here, where they spent less time fixating on the homophone compared to the control word. And if you think about fixation times as being, on average, about 200 to 250 milliseconds, that's a really big spread in terms of spending less time on the homophones. So what it suggests is there's evidence that phonology is being activated and is being used to activate meaning in the other language. So we're seeing this cross-language activation that's happening. And it's happening both during that initial lexical access, but then it's building and growing during integration. Okay, so evidence that there's this phonological processing that's occurring. Perhaps a little bit more interesting to me is, are there differences in the individuals in terms of how that's being demonstrated? And are, for example, more proficient readers using phonology more, or are they using it less? One of the things that we know from the monolingual literature is that as you become a more skilled reader, you seem to use phonology less. So is that true here? So what we did is we used a statistical technique called linear mixed effects models, and what we wanted to do was use individual difference variables as a continuous factor, which is lovely, because what it means is that we can take a look and see whether or not some of these background measures are actually influencing our experimental measures. I'm excited about it because it's something that I'm newly learning. But to show you what we found, I'm going to show a split. And so what we've got here is these are people who, in that test where we had them reading a bunch of words as fast as they could, we split them and we recognized that half of them were less good or low decodability, and half of them were more proficient at decodability. And then we looked at the gaze duration measure, which, as you'll recall or might recall from the previous slide, didn't show any differences. Well, it now shows differences when we take into account the reading ability of our participants. And so those individuals with high decoding ability are showing our effective homophony more. So they're the ones who are accessing the phonology, and they're making use of it, and they're using it to read the meaning of the other word. The high decoders are able to do this, particularly in that initial activation. The low decoders, not so much. When we get to total time, everybody's doing it. Right? We're joining the cool kids here. So what we can see is, yes, that everybody is activating phonology and showing that difference. What's particularly interesting, however, is that the high decoders are spending more time looking at the French words, presumably because they think they can get more out of them. But they're also showing an interaction effect here. So for them, these high-frequency words, they're showing less of a benefit. So imagine that if you're reading and you end up reading a word that has wheat in it, for example, and you're trying to think of the word in English, which is grain, thinking about that. The fact that you know the word in French means 8 actually means that you're not going to benefit as much from homophony because you're thinking of the correct meaning of the word, if that makes sense. So the more skilled decoders are able to actually access the phonology earlier and utilize it to access meaning, but then when we get to total time, they're more sensitive to the frequency of the word. So they recognize that when I see wheat, I shouldn't be thinking blades of grass. I should be thinking of wheat. Okay. Well, what it suggests is that bilinguals activate information from both languages, and that activation doesn't really decrease as reading proficiency increases. So when you think about, okay, they're accessing this information, it's not being turned off, is that beneficial? Can it be beneficial? Can it be interfering? What's happening there? And they're doing it, at an unconscious level. I'm talking about measures where we're looking at eye tracking, where it's not clear if they know that they're spending more time looking at this versus that. So one of the questions that the second study raises is asking about strategies and saying, well, what strategies are readers actually employing when they read for meaning? What do they actually remember? So the second study looks at that. But before I jump into what we did, I want to give you a little bit of theoretical background so you have a sense about the approach that I'm coming from when I think about how are we building our understanding of text? What type of information are we making use of? So the construction integration model is one that's been used fairly extensively to talk about this. And so the nice thing about Pinch's model is he talks about 3 levels of representation for text. The first one is surface form. And so that's really the word-for-word component of the text. Right? That's what we know about the text. What we do know is that when we remember text, we don't typically remember word for word what a text is. Right? What we typically remember is the text space, the meaning of the text. And we make connections between different parts of the text to form a representation that allows us to link up those parts so that we know the meaning of the text. But that's not the only thing. When we read text, we actually construct the text, right? And so what's important to think about there is it's not just what's on the page, it's what the reader brings to the experience. So thinking about, do we make elaborative inferences? So if we're reading a story about something and we have some background information, do we insert that as we create what we remember? And partly that what happens is, later on, if you ask people to tell you what they read, they certainly might tell you some of the things in the text, but they also might insert things that they thought were the text, but really that they had integrated from their knowledge. So an example of this to think about is, we might be familiar with Hamlet, we might be familiar to be or not to be, and people might be able to give me the next little section of that. And if they did, it would probably be just the next section, right? To be or not to be, that is the question, right? Whether or not you know the rest of it depends on how much perhaps you love Shakespeare and love theater. But you might be able to tell me the meaning of it because you have some familiarity with it, but you probably don't remember the full thing. You probably don't remember the surface form unless you're actually asked to perform it. Right? So if you think about your own knowledge of text that you previously have encountered, you can probably see how each of these come online and work together to form what the representation actually ends up being. You remember some of the surface form if it's really important, but mostly it's the text-based and situation model. Okay. So what are some reading strategies then to keep people engaged in order to build this representation? Okay, so that's the question that we want to ask here. And here's a few, right? So as you're reading through, you might be predicting, you might be thinking about what's going to come next. You might be connecting it with something you previously read or something else that's in the text. You might be summarizing it in terms of thinking about just restating what you read. Okay? You might be making inferences in terms of making connections. And it's important to recognize, too, that there's different types of inferences that you can make. So, for example, a necessary inference is one that you need to make in order to understand the text. So something along the lines of, my mother went to the store, she bought some leeks and potatoes but forgot the chicken broth, something like that. Well, one of the necessary inferences that you have to make that you're probably not even aware of that you've made there is, who is she? Right? She is my mother, right? Making that necessary inference. You might make an elaborative inference to sort of say, okay, she bought this, that, and that. What is she planning to make? Who knows, right? Well, maybe she's planning to make potato leek soup, but clearly she can't. She's forgotten the etc. But you make those types of inferences. Okay. What I'm interested in is, are bilinguals doing something similar in each of their languages? So when they're engaging in some of these strategies, Are they using more when they're operating in their second language versus their first language, or are they pretty similar? And then on top of that, what I'm interested in is, well, okay, given these strategies that they're engaging in, and given what we know about their background knowledge, what are they, what's going to predict successful reading comprehension in their first language versus their second language? So this is a study that's in progress that we're still working towards. And in this particular study, currently, we've got 22 bilingual adults who are pre-service teachers from Western. And we were pretty determined to use pre-service teachers because one of the things we know is that when they go out into the classroom, they're going to be asked to engage and teach reading strategies to children. And so we want to know what sort of strategies they engage in, because when they do read alouds, what type of things are they thinking in their own reading, and how does that perhaps differ? So it's important to know what are they doing just to start off with. And an example that we've got, 17 learned English first, 3 said they learned French first, 1 said simultaneously, and 1 indicated that they learned another language first. And here's a little bit of background on them as well. So the age at which they said they learned English, because this is a bit more of a homogeneous group than the previous samples, so maybe a little bit of what they said in terms of in general. They indicated that they learned English at about 1 year of age, and it's interesting to ask people when they learn their first language because they want you to give them the answer. They don't really know the answer. In terms of French, they said around, on average, 5.7 years with a standard deviation of 4.5. So a little bit more variability in the ages there. In terms of their current understanding, what we asked them to do is compare themselves to what they saw as a native speaker. And so native being 10, 1 being not native, and they said their current understanding of English was 9.5, and for French was 8. So these are individuals who have really good French ability, and I should point out that most of them were ones that we recruited from classes where they're intending to go in and teach French. Just that. Vocabulary, we gave them a picture vocabulary task. These are the raw scores. You can see they're significantly better in English than French, but they're still not doing bad in both. So, a few other tasks that we have them do just to round out that individual difference piece that we want to talk about. What are the background variables that are impacting? One was we looked at working memory, and Bailey has been working with me on this kind of test that they probably disliked this task the most. Yes, yes they did, and you might be able to see why. So what we had them do here was they saw 4 figures on the screen at one point for 2 seconds. And there were 26 that there were possibly that could come up. So they had to look at these, and then they looked at them for 2 seconds, and then the screen disappeared, and then in the center of the screen, 1 figure came up. And the figure either was one of these 4, or it was not. And they had to make the decision whether or not they had seen it before. And just to make it more complicated for them, we made it such that in some cases, the figure that they saw wasn't on the previous screen, but it was the previous trial, the one right before. So we tried to make it as interfering as possible. If anybody's interested in trying this task, let us know. We're happy to have you come and give it a whirl. Didn't love it. Okay. We also had that reading fluency piece, where I described it before. 45 seconds, read as many as you can. There's 104 of those items, in both English and in French. And then semantic knowledge. Do you know that lilac or lilacs, is probably a better one, is a flower? Yes, it's living. And then, or no, it's not. And respond as quickly as you can with the button press. That's what they did. Okay, so what was the procedure in terms of this piece? What they had to do with respect to the actual passages that we had them read. So they read 6 stories in English and 6 stories in French, and both of which probably took about half an hour each. Stories were either narratives or they were expository texts. So they either kind of told a story or they were informative in terms of comparing what the difference between the term film and movie is, something along those lines in terms of expository text. So they read 3 of each, and those stories increased in level of difficulty. So they were either easy, medium, or hard. So you can imagine that we've got 1 English story that's a narrative that's easy, 1 that's easy, narrative that's hard, and 1 that's medium. So what we're interested in doing is looking at they're reading 2 sentences aloud. They're reading 2 sentences silently to themselves, and then once they've decided they're done reading those sentences, they hit a button, a beep happens, and then they just have to tell us what they were thinking. So as you're reading the sentence, what went through your mind as you were reading? Tell us about it. And then when they were done doing that for each story, or rather, they finished a story and then they had to answer 3 comprehension questions about the story. Okay? So read a story, talk, answer questions, read another story, etc. Do it in English, do it in French. Some people started with English, some people started with French. Just to cover that. Okay? That's what they did. Then we coded it. Okay, so how did we code it? Well, each think aloud was coded for the type of strategies that people could use. So as you might imagine, if you saw some of those strategies a little bit earlier, these are the strategies that we engaged in. So summarizing, necessary inference, provide an example of that, an elaborative inference, background, questioning, visualizing, predicting, vocabulary. I think that might be the laundry list. There are a few others, but people didn't engage in them very often, so I haven't put them up here. And so what our Excel spreadsheet looked like, just to give you an idea, is here's, let's say this is Think Aloud 1, this is Story 1, Think Aloud 1. We will listen to Think Aloud, and we just note how many times they engage in each of these behaviors. And then if it was Think Aloud 2, they had, they read the next 2 sentences, beep, etc., and then so forth. And so all the way along for all 6 stories in each language, we coded what they were doing. And we operationalized it by saying, okay, if they're doing visualizing, they were saying things like, I'm imagining this or picturing this as I'm reading this. And then for comprehension questions, we assigned a score out of 2 for each comprehension question. So if you want to do the math with me, they did 6 stories and 3 comprehension questions per story. Per story. And then so 18 questions in English, 18 questions in French. So they could possibly get a score as great as 36 in each language. And so 0 if they were completely out in left field and wrong. 1 if they were partially correct. And often the partially correct could have been considered, a complete answer. But there were people who gave sort of more complete answers, right? So for example, one question was about Harriet Tubman, and it asked, when did she travel? And some people just put at night. Other people said at night because they had to hide during the day, etc. But so they gave a bit more of a complete answer as to why that happened. So we gave them more credit for that. Okay. So if I was teaching, this is where I would ask you, what do you think I found? I'll just tell you what we found. I won't ask you. So total strategies coded. In English, we coded 799 strategies. So that was the each time we identified a behavior, we had a check and we had a tick. So 799 for English, 1,052 for French. So they engaged in more strategies overall in French, which we just saw was their language that they were less comfortable in. Still comfortable, but not as comfortable. So they were engaging in more strategies in their less proficient language. And then, so what I've got here is a pie chart to tell you what they did when. So you can see in English, they spent quite a bit of time summarizing the text and telling us what they had read. They also spent a fair bit of time providing those necessary inferences. So to some extent, thinking about building that text base and linking information and sort of saying, okay, this is what this means. And so one example is we had a story about a beekeeper, and it's at the end it talks about the swarm coming towards him, and people were saying, well, he must have been attacked. Well, yes, he was. So they were making these inferences about what was happening there. In terms of elaborative inferences, these are the behaviors that were done clearly less frequently, but a lot of them sort of fall into that sort of thinking beyond the text a little bit, right? So thinking about background measures. Some people said, I remember taking a class about this, and it told us a little bit about that. Some behavior was questioning in terms of saying, I wonder why this happened, I wonder what this means, etc. Visualization, people were sort of visualizing the swarm, for example, things like that. And then predicting what's going to happen next. And then vocabulary. So you notice 7% of the time they talked about vocabulary. When they talked about vocabulary, it was mostly because they said, I don't know what this word means, and it's really interfering with my ability to understand this text. So this is what they did in English. What they do in French. Well, a fair bit of the behaviors were the same, but we can see some clear differences. So about the same amount of time summarizing, but they spent significantly more time creating necessary inferences. So perhaps inferences that they might have thought but didn't articulate in English because it's sort of obvious, they were more willing to explicitly say in French because they seemed to be a bit more linked to the text, to the text as opposed. And then in terms of some of the other behaviors, a little bit less linking it to their background knowledge. And what was interesting is you would expect perhaps that they would be willing to talk about vocabulary a little bit more because they had less knowledge of vocabulary. There wasn't so much of that. It's like when you're listening to these think alouds, it's like they sort of already acknowledge that they don't necessarily know vocabulary, so they're not going to point it out every time they don't know something. What was the sense of it? So and again, their behavior for vocabulary was very similar in French and English. They were basically saying, I don't know what this word means, and interfering with my ability to understand this text. As opposed to, this vocabulary word, I'm not sure what it means, but my knowledge of English would lead me to believe this. There really wasn't much of that behavior, which actually surprised me a fair bit. Okay, so some similarities, some differences in terms of what they were doing. What does that mean in terms of reading comprehension? So what we can do, or what I did, is I said, okay, we're going to make reading comprehension our dependent variable, and then we're going to see if any of the behaviors that they engage in predict successful behavior, predict success. So we did a multiple regression, and it predicted 76% of the variance in their performance, which is pretty good in terms of thinking about differentiating between the people who are doing well and the people who are doing less well. What we found was the individuals who are doing elaborative inferencing tended to have better comprehension. Okay? So if you're expanding beyond the text, if you're working with a situation model, then you're responding to questions a little bit better. Interestingly, prediction with a negative variable or negative predictor, which is kind of interesting. So you would think that if people are predicting and thinking beyond, that would help them. But I think what I need to do is go back and listen and see when they predict, are they predicting the right thing or are they predicting the wrong thing? That might be something that's happening. The other thing that might be happening is they might be predicting things that they should already know based on what they've read, and they just didn't pick up on that. So that might be another possibility. Visualizing. Individuals who are visualizing were showing better comprehension, or at least that's one of the predictors in the model that gives us the best comprehenders. And the final one was French semantic reaction time. So that was the task with the lilac, where they have to decide, except it was in French. So substitute French word here, and then they had to decide. Interestingly, this is a negative predictor, and I'm sorry, that should be a period there. Negative predictor, meaning that the faster you're able to do that task, the better able you were with comprehension. So this is basically our measure of French ability, French knowledge. French vocabulary didn't come out as a significant predictor of the model. So what it suggests is greater use of elaborate inferences, visualization, and greater French lexical access predicted reading comprehension, which is quite interesting in terms of thinking about the behaviors that people were engaging in terms of being successful. So English, what was happening with English? I sort of started out with the easier one, because English, I threw these variables into the model, and the computer said, no, not happening, nothing there in terms of showing predictors. What was interesting, however, was that I kind of went down the rabbit hole a little bit, as an expression, and that I was following something and trying to see where it was going to take me. And one of the things that I had to do was that task that I told you everybody hated. Right, so that working memory task where they're doing the figures, what's going on there? But one thing I found that I could not explain and I was really confused by was the fact that individuals who did better at saying something wasn't there, so just deciding that the figure wasn't there, the individuals who did better on that were, sorry, let me flip this. Ones who did better at that were the ones who were not as good with the reading comprehension. So basically, I have this working memory variable where I'm finding that people who have worse working memory are doing better at English reading comprehension. Well, that didn't make much sense to me. So I looked at the variable again. What I actually found was it wasn't really measuring working memory. What it was measuring was people's willingness to say something was there when it wasn't there. So for example, when you're doing a button press task, you have two options, right? You can be really conservative and say no to absolutely everything. And if you say no to absolutely everything, you're going to be really accurate on saying no. And those are the people who did really poorly on the comprehension, right? If you're willing to say yes and be more liberal, then you're actually willing to try, right? You're willing to say yes, I think it's there, because you're going to be more accurate on saying yes, something is there, but you're also going to be less accurate on saying no, it's not there, because you're always saying yes. So the people who are always saying yes are the people, and this is the C-score that I calculated. These are the people who are always saying yes, and always saying yes it gets you a negative value. But the key idea is people who are always saying yes to this response, or who are more likely to say yes to this response, had better English reading comprehension. And what my suggestion here is that these are the people who are willing to try. Those are the people who are willing to take a risk and say, I'm not quite sure if it was there, but I'm going to say yes. As opposed to the person who was like, I don't know at all, I'm not really sure, no to everything. And so when you're listening to some of these answers in English, there are people who are willing to say, who want to say, I just don't know, whereas other people actually give an answer, which, in all likelihood could be correct, and therefore are getting it right, as opposed to people who are not willing to make that effort. And you can see that in this working memory task, because they didn't enjoy it so much. You can see that there's different approaches. You can be conservative or liberal. And if you were liberal, you were also perhaps willing to share what you thought the passage was about. So what came out? Sort of this willingness to try score is what I'm going to call it. And this semantic, basically your ability in English in terms of your lexical access. So if you're better in English, that's also taken into account in the model. So greater willingness to try, which is also greater willingness to be wrong, right? And faster lexical access in English were associated with better comprehension scores in English, which is very interesting because it suggests that the strategies that they're engaging in, everybody's using pretty much similar strategies, or even if they're using different strategies, it doesn't seem to be impacting their reading comprehension score in English anyway, and in French it definitely is. So some final thoughts about this. Proportionally, bilinguals engaged in similar strategies across their two languages, but overall more strategies were utilized in their weaker of the two languages in French, which is good because you want people to be modifying their behavior based on how difficult they find the tasks they're engaging in. More necessary inferences were articulated, suggesting that they were really more deliberate in constructing a text based on they understood what was in the text. The people who were more successful in comprehension were the ones who were able to take that text and elaborate on it and think about it with respect to situation model. And surprisingly, very few participants articulated direct connections between English and French. There was a lot of translating that happened. But as I pointed out, there wasn't a lot of making use of their knowledge of English to support their French in a clearly articulated way. So it would be interesting to take a look at something like this in terms of a think aloud and combine it with an eye tracking to see, are they spending more time, when they're tackling a passage that they find difficult, are they spending more time on the words that could help them given their English knowledge? So as texts become more difficult, oftentimes, at least between English and French, there tends to be a lot of cognates that come up. So cognate is a word that's shared between languages, like table, in English, French, table, tab. And you can make use of that. So there's one, and I could have perhaps put this up, but there was one particular person who indicated that, she said something in French, she goes, le torrent convergea. I don't know what that means. Well, if you translate that to English, it's the torrent converged on something. And so she could have pulled information from potential knowledge of English to facilitate, and she didn't really, and not nobody, but there's very few instances of that, which is very interesting because that's really a problem-solving way of accessing information. And then, as I said, performance in English was linked to lexical access, which was English knowledge, but also willingness to be wrong, and willingness to actually hazard a guess. And interesting to think about some of the implications of that in language learning, in terms of who's going to be successful to look silly and be wrong versus those who are not. And so I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and here's some of the collaborators who worked with me and students who gave their time. Just to keep in with the flower theme, this is from my backyard. It has weathered a couple snows so far and still holding strong, so I'm feeling hopeful. All right, the questions are welcome and appreciated.
I had a couple thoughts.
Mhm.
One of them is the techniques used. I think would a bilingual learner maybe describe their read aloud differently if they were speaking in French when they were responding than for English? So for example, if you were speaking, you read something in French and then you were talking about it in English, you would describe it differently because you'd be translating the words at that moment to respond in English.
Possibly, and we might consider looking at that difference because actually of the 22 people, and I don't have an exact count, but perhaps at least a good third, maybe half of them, we gave them the option. We said, talk in whichever language you prefer for your Think Aloud, because we didn't want to limit them in terms of not being able to say what they wanted to say if it was a weaker language. So some of them decided to do their Think Aloud in English, and some of them did it in French. And so it would be interesting to put that variable in. It would probably, yeah, I could certainly do that, and that would be an interesting direction to go.
And the other thing I was thinking is when you first mentioned wheat, I didn't ever think about that as a homonym for wheat.
Mm-hmm.
Because wheat is like HW, a schwa, and a T, and it's like wheat. Mm-hmm. And wheat is a whole other word. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if people considered all those words as homonyms or not. When there's a lot.
There's a lot, and we always talk about them as close homophones. And so I think sort of the proof is in the pudding in the sense that they respond to them differently than they do to control words.
Right.
And there certainly might be some that are better examples than others, and part of it has to do with, for example, we know that homophones that have greater orthographic overlap tend to produce more effects than ones that don't. But yeah, that's something to consider. It would also be interesting to see which group you put through. So, for example, if you're English Anglophone and French is your second language, then wheat sounds an awful lot more like wheat in English than it would to somebody for whom it's their first language. Other questions? Thoughts about how to proceed with the data analysis? Because we're still working towards that with both of them.
I'm just wondering, I know it's early, but as a former teacher of French, just wondering where this might go in terms of if I have students that are various English comprehension, that's their first language, and I want them to do better in reading the French, knowing all of these variables that could be, especially the one with the elaborating. Mm-hmm. Would that be something to really focus on for a French teacher to focus on to get her kids to go there and get?
That's an excellent question. I think thinking about that in terms of studies you can do to take a look at that, and I think the literature would support that, at least as an attempt, because one of the things about that is it's not just clearly French knowledge that's eating up all the variance in that analysis. So the fact that people are elaborating despite the fact that their language skills might not be as strong is really crucial towards thinking about the fact that even if you're perhaps more focused on the surface form of the text space, engaging in more processes that are explicitly trying to engage in more processes that link what you actually understand to what you previously know should support your reading comprehension, I would think.
So one thing we had a very successful was Addison Wesley. The kids just ate it up. And I think it involved that kind of visualizing. It was what they call graphic novels now, the cartoon characters. So this, of course, relaxed the kids in terms of their anxiety. I don't know, and I don't want to get called out. And there was some of those variables where it was, what do you think is going to happen next, and visualize, because there is that role there where somehow they may take it in by osmosis. If they see these cartoon characters doing things, it may work its way in. So what I'm hearing is all of these may contribute. So, push that whole thing a much richer, instead of just worried about the reading, the comprehension, a little bit more of the reading skills per se, the prediction and generalization.
Well, and one of the things that we know too is that the generation effect is really such that you understand something better if you produced it yourself. So having the opportunity to read something and then talk it through, elaborate on it, and expand on it, make those overt connections, supports memory later on. So thinking about engaging in that type of behavior at all levels of proficiency is what we're thinking about. Absolutely. That's a great question. question for you. Thanks. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate you coming out.
Yeah, that's interesting.